I used the word wee walk before, so that's what we're going to do. We're going to take a wee walk through the past 4 weeks, including this week, because I saw a mountain bike video called A Wee Day Out. So if you just Google Wee Day Out, mountain biking, it's an awesome little YouTube clip about what you can do on a mountain bike. So anyway, let's go for a wee walk. So, and let's hope a clicker works. So basically what I'm doing is taking us through what I see as some of the highlights. If you go to my website, you can easily become a subscriber to a newsletter. If you want to talk to me directly, then you can use that email to make it so that we can communicate. So, wait. Cool. So the first week we started off with Kristen Wood, talking about the physics of the universe. So many people know about machines, and some people think of the atom as like a machine, and therefore they think of it a bit simple. So what was so great about Kristen's talk is she illustrated that atoms, these building blocks of matter, are certainly not simple. I think most of us learnt a lot from Kristen's talk. For instance, we learnt about quarks and leptrons. We learnt about force carriers and Higgs boson to a small extent. And it just started to really open up the complexity that's even in what supposedly is the basic building block of all matter. Kristen went on and talked about the forces. You might remember she talked about the strong nuclear force, the weak nuclear force, and of course the other forces we know a bit about are gravity and electromagnetism. These forces had to be created in the same way as the particles have to be created. We often don't think about forces being created, but forces don't just exist in a vacuum, they had to eventuate as well. As Bill was talking about with the label consciousness emerging, well, that's just a description, it's not an explanation. So when we talk about forces, it's important to realise, well, where did they come from as well? The forces, by the way, are very strong. I was just a bit interested to see just how strong is a strong nuclear force. I thought, well, you know, being in such a small little world of an atom, maybe it's not that big. It's actually 6,000 trillion times stronger than gravity. Now, our bodies don't cope really well with 8 gravity forces, and yet our atoms have a force that's so powerful to help hold them together. Why was Kristen giving us this talk about the fine-tuned universe? Part of it was to demonstrate the complexity even at this sub-microscopic level. So that's important. If the complexity exists even at that level, then that once again is an indicator of a designer, an intelligent designer, and a powerful one that can create forces and have them controlled. Kristen was also talking about the precision required. Now, it's true that you could design something complex like a space shuttle, but precision does something more. Precision lets you know about carefulness, doesn't it? So I could drive a really fancy car in terms of complexity, but if the door panels were 10 millimetres apart from the rest of the body of the car, you'd say, well, it might be complex, but there's not much precision in it, is there? You know, if the windows went up 99% of the way, but not the last 1%, you'd say, well, once again, it's got some great complexity, but no precision. This space shuttle, of course, illustrates that. That's a space shuttle Challenger. So some of you might remember in January 1986, it took off. It didn't last very long before it blew up. The space shuttle at launch weighs about 2,000 tonnes. It's 56 metres long. And why did it blow up? It was because of some O-rings. So O-rings are like gaskets, bits of rubber that help seal things. So there was 2 O-rings that were meant to do their job. And they would have done their job, but they weren't quite made to the right precision in terms of their ability to cope with an extra cold morning. That was a problem. So these O-rings, which are about 3.6 metres in diameter, 7 millimetres thick as they go around, the ones on one side of the ship were a bit colder than the ones on the sunny side of the ship. so that rubbery type compound wasn't as pliable as it should have been. It resulted in a gap of 0.74 of a millimetre, so less than 1 millimetre. And that's why 7 astronauts died. Kristen explained that the level of precision that's involved in us being here and the universe existing and not blowing up is millions of times greater than what the precision is in a space shuttle. So I hope that helps put you in perspective what precision is about. Certainly the complexity points to an intelligent designer, the precision points to a careful designer, and also helps us to see, if you like, just how incredibly well made something is. So that's what Kristen did. We then had a talk later on by, I'll flick to the next slide. Oh, if you want to go further, by the way, if you go to creation.com and you type in experimental nuclear physicist or experimental nuclear physics, you can come across 2 names. So one is Dr. Jim Mason, the other one is Dr. Heinz Lyklama. Lycklama, I think his spelling is. And these are experimental nuclear physicists. They believe God made the world in 6 days, about 6,000 years ago. And you can go a lot further with what Kristen said by reading about them in creation.com. Next slide, please. Not sure. Yeah, great. So then we had Dr. Ron Neller. Now, Dr. Ron Neller is here again today. And he was explaining that not only is God a God of who's an intelligent designer, but God actually reveals himself to us. And he was explaining how we've got this revelation in the book of Genesis, and then we've also got the revelation from earth. And Dr. Neller, being someone who specialises in the sediments and how water has shaped the earth, could see this great alignment between what the Bible's talked about, a global flood, and what he had been seeing for 30 plus years as a professor. And he explained that the only way to make sense of the evidence he saw was to have an understanding that there was a global flood. That's after 30 years of looking at the evidence as someone who's not a Christian. In fact, it's a very surprising conclusion he came to when you think about it. He was well aware, as a professor and someone who had consultancies, that if you let the cat out of the bag, so to speak, if you let people know that your worldview is no longer an evolutionary worldview, it will cost you, or is likely to cost you. And it did. That was a cessation of him being a professor. That was a cessation of contracts. And yet he was aware of these repercussions, but what did he do? Did he ignore the evidence? He followed it where it led. Some of you have had very traumatic upbringings, and some of you know others who have had extremely traumatic upbringings. And I've certainly met people who are extremely bitter by the trauma that they've had, in some cases just the trauma that they've perceived, and they can't imagine that there is a God who's all-powerful and all-loving. And yet Ron was also someone who was able to overcome that scenario of not having a dignified childhood and still come to the point where he could believe that there's an all-powerful and all-loving God. So if you want to go further, I know every night we try to cover a bit of ground, but if you want to go further, if you look up a fellow called Dr. John Baumgardner, B-A-U-M Gardner, all one word, and a guy called Mark Horstmeyer, H-O-R-S-T-E-M-E-Y-E-R. I think next slide. There we go, at the top. And Mantle and Genesis. If you just type in those 2 names and 2 words, then you can read a lot more about plate tectonics. Some people say what Christians talk about isn't possible because things happen so slow. Well, as you heard from Ron, Dr. Neller, the evidence is actually the opposite. The evidence is that the history of the world, as revealed through incredibly thick sediments and millions of fossils, is that a lot of things have happened very quick. And in terms of plate tectonics, if you look up these guys, then you can read a lot more about the evidence that it is reasonable that plate tectonics actually happened quite quickly. Baumgartner, he's actually got a PhD in geophysics and space physics. Dr. Mark Horstmeyer, he's a professor of mechanical engineering. He's written over 500 papers and reports. And once again, if you type in those 4 names, you'll come across one of their papers. Then we had Sarah Jane. Sarah Jane presented more of a biological picture. So the evidence from Sarah Jane was that bird navigation is a way of seeing the complexity not in the inanimate building blocks of the world, but in terms of the living creatures of the world. And as much as some of us have always mocked the idea of a bird brain and insulted our colleagues, our friends by saying they've got a bird brain, we now realise that having a bird brain wouldn't be too bad a thing, at least if you're trying to do cross-country or orienteering or travel the globe. So with Sarah Jane's talk, she talked about this concept of irreducible complexity. The idea is that there's a certain structure and it needs to have a minimum number of components to build. Now, in an evolutionary scenario, what they try to say is that in that structure, like a mousetrap, the first thing evolution did, evolution, as if it's an entity with a mind and a purpose, evolution did was create a part of it. But that's not the way evolutionary scenarios actually works, is it? Because every bit has got to have a selective advantage. So supposedly in the evolutionary scenario, some sort of random mutation happens in your DNA, some sort of letter is not the same letter as it was before, and you end up with a new structure, supposedly. But that new structure has got to be beneficial. If it's not beneficial, if it's just consuming more energy, or if it's actually doing something harmful, then it'll disappear. So we call that process natural selection. Artificial selection is, of course, when we kill off too many kangaroos. Artificial selection is what has happened in some modern wars, of course, where people have tried to exterminate certain races. Natural selection is the idea that in nature there are certain forces at work that kill off the weaker beings. So if you're a creature and you're born with a bung shoulder, an arm that doesn't work so well, then you're probably not going to get a chance to breed, and so your population, your progeny aren't going to happen, and you'll be wiped out. So once again, with irreducible complexity, the idea is how on earth can random mutations create something that's advantageous when you need the whole kit caboodle, you need the whole structure to be there. And what Sarah Jane pointed out, you don't just need structures, you need interacting structures. She talked about the birds needing clocks and compasses and maps. Another way of picturing this is imagine there was this protein. Remember Sarah Jane talked about clocks? So they're the physiological processes and structures that tell a bird you've got to fly somewhere. And then, of course, the bird needs a navigation system, a compass, then it needs a map. So it can go all the way from Moreton Bay to Alaska. If in the evolutionary idea, what came first was a protein structure that told you to fly, what use would that be? Fly where? And how would I get there even if I knew where was? And so it all helps you to hopefully understand irreducible complexity. In other words, it's not a theory that is trying to explain gaps. It's trying to explain what we know about how the real world works. And Sarah Jane talked about how if you came across a corpse of a person and there were 9 bullets in it, you would come to the reasonable conclusion that those bullets were there because someone had been shot 9 times. You wouldn't think, well, maybe they had some sort of pathological process or a weird cancer that created these things that just look like bullets. You would know that, no, what we're seeing is the evidence of bullets. Once again, if you want to go further, if you go to creation.com and type in ornithologist, you'll come across a very famous, in academic circles, ornithologist called Dr. Jon Clerke. So Ahlquist, and you can read about how impressive his knowledge was, and yet once again he believes in the world being created in 6 days about 6,000 years ago. If you type in the phrase aerodynamics and thermodynamics, you'll come across a guy called Professor Andy McIntosh. So he's got a PhD in combustion thermodynamics. He's got a DSc in applied mathematics. He's written a lot about aerodynamics. And once again, someone who's very intelligent. He's looked at the evidence and understands that this all points to the Bible being a true revelation of how God created the world and when. So what about my talks? So why are we here? So part of the reason why we're here is to help you to see that it is reasonable to take the words in the Bible as being a record of what Jesus said and did, and what God has done in history. So if there is this God that we believe in, Jesus Christ, being the creator of the universe, has revealed himself. He doesn't try to be secretive, he tries to reveal himself. And he has revealed himself through history. And the Bible is a record of his interaction with people throughout all of history. If that's the case, then we should be able to see through history and science evidence of this interaction. And there should be a dovetailing, like I was explaining about what Ron showed to us. What I did was, with the history side of things, help you to see that there is good evidence that what we've got is actually a historical record of what God said and did. We started off with showing that the idea that Genesis and the stories it contains about how God created the world, when God created the world, about the worldwide flood, that there's no evidence it came from Babylonian myths, despite this being a strong and pervasive idea. In fact, I call it a strong and pervasive myth, that Genesis comes from myths. And we had some fun going through looking at those myths, the Enuma Elisha myth, for instance, about creation, and the so-called Gilgamesh flood, or the Utnapishtim flood is more accurately myth as well. And we showed how vastly different these are with their stories. As you know, in one of them, in the Enuma Elish, a god had to be murdered so his blood could be taken to be used to man. Another monster goddess, she had to be slaughtered, and the breasts of her carcass were used to create mountains. Is this really ringing a bell when you read Genesis? I don't think so. And then we looked at the fact that there's no evidence within the Bible, despite what they say, that what we read in the Bible is actually of a Babylonian origin. As part of that, we also looked at the lifespans. And this is a really important point. So in Genesis, we have this history of the lifespans being around 912 years on average before the flood. Then after that, they decayed in an exponential decay curve. And we pointed out that this is strong evidence that the data you're reading about the lifespans is real. It's not fabricated data. Some of you might be having trouble remembering all the talks we've given over all these 4 weeks. The good news is all but one of the talks so far have been uploaded onto YouTube. So if you go to Echoes of Jesus, my website, and you click the YouTube link there and go to videos, you'll see about 30 videos from a sample of previous years, and as I said, all of the talks this year except for my last talk. The remaining talks will be put up in the next week. So don't worry if you can't remember everything that Ron said. Don't worry if you need to hear Bill's talk a second time. It will be accessible. Okay, so next slide. So we've talked a lot about how the New Testament and the Old Testament together present an accurate record of what God has done intervening in this world. And therefore we talked about how when we read that Jesus said, "I am the resurrection and the life, he who believes in me will live even though he dies." And how we can trust those words. That was one of the other talks I gave, wasn't it? About how the copying of the Bible has been done accurately, and we can see that in the way the documents compare with each other over time. So that's just a little wee walk through 4 weeks' worth of seminars. I promised that it will be short. So what I'd like now is for the presenters to come up on stage, and you guys get to ask some questions. Can I repeat that question first, to the best of my ability? Yeah, I think what Joe's saying is that given that some creatures that are often called dinosaurs, like the pterosaurs, look like almost flying dragons, certainly be fun to have as a pet, and seeing that they had so much ability to fly, what's their relationship with birds and dinosaurs? Is that correct? Thank you, Joe.
Yeah, if I can remember the tree of the reptiles, I think pterosaurs are on a completely different line. So that's why I didn't talk about them, because I was focusing mainly on the most commonly accepted theory now is that theropod dinosaurs are the favoured ones that evolutionists believe led to the birds. The other ones have secondarily developed ways of flying, and yes, certainly there are pterosaurs that could, I understand, fly fairly well. But because they were all completely different on a different line, that's why I didn't include them.
So maybe if I could sum up, just like we have creatures that are not at all birds but fly, like bats for instance, some of these other creatures unfortunately are extinct. So not related. They don't look like they're of any use in terms of trying to prove the evolution from dinosaurs to birds. They just look like another type of creature that God created, but unfortunately is now extinct.
Incidentally, I was just reading a paper, I think either today or yesterday, saying that now they're trying to say that these that some of the pterosaurs, if not most of them, had these proto-feathers on them. And yet once again you've got the situation that they don't need them to fly, they're not feathers, they couldn't have been selected for feathers. So these proto-feathers are cropping up all over the place. So it's doubtful whether they really are precursors to feathers.
Thank you. Peter.
That's a question we commonly get, because we'll use ourselves that terminology, but we do so simply to make a connection with the person we're speaking with. They were raised in that sort of terminology and that educational system. However, particularly within CMI, we have a complete map of an alternative system, not necessarily one based on dates, but on events. And so we look particularly at the history of the earth as pre-flood, during the flood, various stages of the flood, then after the flood. So for example, Fraser Island is an after the flood. It's even after the Ice Age type event. So what we do is we try and do our best to align them. Can we align them perfectly? No, because we don't rely on the dates themselves. We don't accept that at all. In fact, as a secular scientist, I walked away from the dating technology before I became a Christian. It is so fraught with errors. And so the reason we use it is simply to make a connection to help people. In the end, though, I wouldn't rely upon that as being, I would never use that as being realistic. It's to build a relationship which you then sit down with the person and a bit more. You might have some more comments?
No, I think you've covered it pretty well, but the only thing I would add is that it's useful in terms of sequences. And Ron explained that very well in his talk about the different sequences, and he'd have things like the dates like I did, or the supposed evolutionary dates, but saying that, well, they're only indicative, but the sequences are very useful.
I'll just repeat the question again, just for some people. So Peter's asking a question about where does the Ice Age fit into the history of the universe, history of the world rather. So it's a great question. Before Ron gets a chance to answer that, I just want to recap and check with Ron. So what I heard you say in response to Peter's question, and usually there's only one question per person tonight, by the way, so Peter's already in the bad books. And usually once you've asked your question, you've got to wait for somebody else, but we'll let Peter go, he's special. And so what you were saying, if I heard correctly, Ron, Dr. Neller, is that when you were still believing with all your heart and soul that the evolutionary scenario was correct, you wouldn't use radiometric dating techniques to try to understand what you were seeing in different countries around the world. Is that correct?
That is correct. In the earlier geologic literature, I don't mean that early, but I mean even 20 years ago, even the top geologists then were saying, do not rely upon this, never use the date to give you a new idea, only publish the dates that actually confirms your paradigm. That's actually written in the geologic literature because the dating techniques are based on a set of assumptions that have all been proven incorrect. One is, for example, is that the rock when it's formed must have a zero date. Must have, that's an assumption we have to make. Yet analyses being done by secular and Christian scientists all around the world could point to a new lava flow coming out, even from great depth, to be anywhere from 3 million to 3 billion years age using current technologies. We also have over 40 different techniques which overlap with each other, but where they overlap, you'll get entirely different dates. And there are many papers throughout in sequencing where they've tried to understand something where they've demonstrated that if that date is incorrect, then they'll find another dating technique until they get the right date. And that has been done many times in the literature. So there is no proof whatsoever that the rock when formed has a zero date in it at all. And there's a number of other assumptions as well in that. So I won't go into that. I'll give you a chance.
Can I add a quick one to that one? I found exactly the same thing when I was looking at the dates of some of the birds. There were some birds that were obviously modern, basically birds, clearly not dinosaurs. They were in one of the Chinese formations, and they were initially dated in the middle of the dated Jurassic, similar time to when Archaeopteryx was around. They went and did some of the dating and moved them conveniently across into the middle of the Cretaceous because it didn't kind of make sense. So, and that's where they stayed.
And Ron, would you be happy to answer a question from someone anonymously in the audience who asked, where on earth can we fit in the Ice Age, and was there only one Ice Age, is the question I'll tag on.
There's some good evidence of an Ice Age period, absolutely. I lived in Finland for a number of years. I was a bit disappointed when I first went there. I was taught that moraines and all this were giant features, and I was once standing on a metre-high little lump, and the Finns went, this is a moraine. I went, what, this is a moraine? But anyhow, they have hundreds of them everywhere. And I looked at it even then as a secular scientist, and I said, but they're all basically interconnected. Was there one Ice Age? And they went, well... And I said, but you say there's many Ice Ages, why? And they grinned and said, every Finnish man wants to have an Ice Age named after him, so every moraine gets a different name in that. But it's all interesting. But was there an Ice Age? Well, put it this way, within creation ministries, you've got top astrophysicists and meteorological people like Michael Ord, who was part of the US Meteorological Association, a very senior person there. You've got a lot of other people like Taz Walker and elsewhere, have all written up this multiple times in creation.com. So if you type in Ice Age, essentially after the flood, given that incredible change in temperatures, water occupancy of the planet compared to before and so on, there was a period when there was a sort of a rapid adjustment in temperatures. Now we see that there was an Ice Age also by looking at our own coastal features. They very clearly indicate an Ice Age because if you actually go offshore, probably in the order of about 80 kilometres and 80 to 100 metres deep, you will find sand dunes on the edge of the continental shelves. They're aeolian-blown sand dunes, not anything to do with the ocean itself. So that's when the ice was around, it dropped, the sea level was dropped. You'll even find, as I think I put in one of my slides, I may not have highlighted it, but the river, the Fitzroy River, its channel is still shown on the continental shelf. In other words, all the continental shelves were completely exposed during this period. But the argument that comes back from a physics point of view, an atmospheric point of view and so on, by those who are experiencing that, and I'm not, is that there was one Ice Age. And what you see with those multiple moraines is simply the fluctuation as it withdrew and so on. Now, a lot more information is available. If you type in Michael Ord, he's written many books on that and is quite recognised for that one.
Sounds like a good seriously topic, I think. Maybe next year we'll do one on, was there one Ice Age, what did it look like, how did it relate to Noah's flood? Sure. Can I have a crack at repeating your question? I think what you were asking was that given there's a certain progress towards supposedly creating true artificial intelligence, if we got a little bit closer so we actually had some degree of artificial intelligence, would it change the timescale to develop true artificial intelligence? Is that a reasonable interpretation of your question?
Yes, because of the amounts of the data So, yeah.
Okay,
thanks,
I'll hand it over to Bill to try to nuance your question more and then answer it.
It is a little bit creepy what they are capable of doing in China already. So not only is the surveillance literally on every street and every alleyway, it is capable of recognizing facial identity, even when you're wearing a face mask. They can identify this person from the next, and they go further and talk about emotional intent, right? So they can tell when someone's up to no good, just by looking at their face on a camera, which is Google like megapixels or whatever it is, gigapixels of clarity. I don't know though that the problem is solved by merely quantums of data. If there is no end to the extraordinary amount of data that's already collected on us, and that's only going to exponentially increase with every passing year. The problem, though, isn't merely a question of volumes of data. Mimicry is another word you used there, and you were focusing in on. And somebody gave me a video of an attempt to make essentially a robot that responded to emotional input. They put it on a TV show. Her name's Sophia. And Sophia was having a chat with the TV presenter, and there she was sort of cracking jokes and pretending that she could take over his job. But it was fascinating. Just watching the beginning of the interview was you had the bloke who made Sophia, and then you've got this robot dummy thing standing there. The greeting that actually happened between the human beings totally ignored Sophia standing there, and there was no sense in which they were at any point sort of recognizing that they were in a conversation with an actual human being. My hope is that the talk I've given shares with you just a bit about the sheer range of the human experience and what it is that it constitutes. That the amount, and I'm hoping that little video also helped insofar as how much have we really, to understand what it is we have to scan, just to then create something that was a fair representation of you instead of some ruined mind. I thought it was a useful thought that actually don't even know what to scan. We're talking trillions of interconnections in a dynamic, live array that no one has even begun to replicate, let alone understand. The sheer range and variety of interactions that occur in your mind to create you is beyond human comprehension. Mimicry isn't enough. Simulation is not duplication. You could simulate it. You could have a robot aping human type behavior. And another comment I heard was that humans are really cheap dates. By that I mean they can see a very simple image of a face. They could see two dots and a smile and start to interact with it because we are wired for faces, right? And we kid ourselves that we're actually having a relationship with a thing that's actually very simple. But all it's doing is holding up a mirror to ourselves. It's more about what we hope it is than what it actually is. And so there's this business of the interaction that we're very forgiving of things that are pretending to be human, but they're really not. Siri, when it talks to us, we think we're having a conversation with it. We're not. It's what is it doing? It's responding to voice input and coming up with massively fast searches on stuff it finds on the internet, based on the programmers who made Siri, who will probably answer things, in a very preconditioned way. You'd have. I'll end on a joke, and because one of the people who I listen to who talks about hacking, cyber hacking. So I'm interested in cyber. I'm an auditor and into cyber stuff, and he didn't know a happy way of ending one of his very sad talks, and so he thought he'd ask Siri for a joke. He said, "Siri, tell me a joke," and she said, "Your privacy." That was it.
Can I try to repeat what you're asking, or I think you're asking Bill to respond to the idea that can artificial intelligence, if it's being made by humans, is there any hope that it could actually be more altruistic than the humans it interacts with? Is that a fair summation? Thank you, Wayne.
Can you code for political correctness? Yeah, that's a huge question. Obviously, I mean, we as humans don't get it right. I'll answer it with just a very quick reference that I've talked to John a bit about as well, and it's to do with something called the moral machine experiment. And the moral machine experiment was conducted all over the world by MIT. There they were doing research and answering questions about autonomous vehicles and what sorts of decisions these things should make when they're faced with a certain death situation. In other words, there's perhaps people crossing the road in front of an autonomous vehicle, and the only thing that vehicle can do in order to avoid running them over and killing them is perhaps to go to the side, crash into a wall, and therefore kill the occupants of the vehicle. Right? Very morbid subject. But there they were asking a variety of questions, and they literally asked them all over the world, right, about a variety of scenarios of what's described as the philosophical trolley problem, and so they would say, look, what happens if there's one or two occupants in the car, and they're faced with a situation where there's where there's one person crossing the road, or three people crossing the road, or three young people crossing the road, or three people crossing the road illegally versus legally. What are the various decisions that this autonomous vehicle should do in a certain death situation? Should it just run over the people who are crossing the road illegally, or the ones of a low socioeconomic position, or should it spare the ones who are young or look like dogs, or on and on? What they did, they asked a survey, 230 countries all over the world, pretty much everywhere where there is humanity, these same questions, and they all came back with a variety of different answers, right, in terms of what was moral, what was right, who should die. in this experiment, and the thought sort of came back on a couple of levels. We're not going to be able to manufacture a vehicle that's going to essentially reflect any sort of consensus view, because there isn't one. There is no consensus view that we can even make about that kind of dilemma, let alone far greater dilemmas. Another problem is whether or not I would ever buy an autonomous vehicle if I knew that in certain circumstances it would kill me deliberately. Who would buy an autonomous vehicle on those terms? Would you wish to have such a vehicle? Most people, when they buy a car, they act in self-interest, right? And they want to retain control. And whatever outcomes happen in bad situations, they want it to favor them, right? But no, not with autonomous. So how are we ever going to have autonomous cars? How are we ever going to have a situation where there's mixed traffic? There's people with human drivers and others with robot drivers, and they're all next to each other, and they're all supposed to be making good moral decisions. We can't even solve that problem, let alone anything that's, iRobot, 3 laws safe, Asimov, and all that. No. These things are receding horizons at every level.
Thank you very much, Bill. And I thought that was very well answered regarding moral dilemmas, in that which morals are you going to buy your car from? Maybe if you get your car and it's made in China, it'll have different morals to one that might have been made in Australia. Right. Maybe it has different morals because it was made on a Friday afternoon versus a Monday morning when things are looking good. But we're going to have to call it quits there now. It's 9:25. Thank you very much all for coming along. We hope that we can continue interaction with you all, one-on-one or over a coffee or whatever. But thank you so much. I want to finish on one quick note, just one quick note. One of the things that may have been misunderstood is the interplay between science and religion. So I'm going to leave you with a quote to hang. And so this comes from a Professor Michael Ruse, so R-U-S-E. He was a professor of philosophy at Florida State University. He said in the year 2000, in that same quote that I'm about to say, that he was an ex-Christian, he's an atheist. He actually he actually wrote his PhD on the nature of biology, so he does know about biology, but even though he's a philosopher. And he said, evolution is a religion. This was true of evolution from the beginning and is still true of evolution today. So once again, an ex-Christian, evolutionist, atheist, saying loud and clear that what you think is a clear dividing, or may think, is a clear dividing line between science and evolution is not at all clear. It's quite a fuzzy line. Thank you all again.